Now there's a second question that I want to talk about that I think Aspasius focuses on. And that's the question, can there be degrees of virtue and vice? Now that's an odd question, but I want to start with that question first, to try to understand what Aspasius is worried about. And once we think that through, I think we'll be in a better position to address the question of whether there's only one way of getting things right. So let's begin by thinking about some things that Aristotle and Aspasius have to say about this question of degrees of virtue. First of all, let's put the question in a somewhat more precise form. What do I mean in saying, can there be degrees of virtue? Well, what I really mean is something like this. Can you be virtuous and yet less virtuous than someone else? Can you be, for example, courageous, but less courageous than someone else? Or it takes on a different tone, really, Aspasius stresses, when we think about actions. Can an action be just, but another action even more just? Or can something be courageous, but another action be even more courageous? If we think about those questions, Aspasius, I think, has some very subtle and interesting things to say. First of all, let's talk about people. Can somebody be just, but someone else more just? Can someone be courageous, but someone else even more courageous? There, his answer is yes. With respect to people, we might say that you count as having a virtue if you tend to act in accordance with that virtue, if you tend to do the right thing. So, for example, you might say someone counts as just if they tend to do the just thing, or a just thing. And someone tends to be courageous if they tend to act courageously in the right kinds of situations. Now, that tendency, in both cases, might not have to be perfect. And so we might think of it in terms of the strength of a disposition to act justly or act courageously. We might think of it in terms of, well, the likelihood or the reliability of your acting courageously or justly. And so in those cases, Aspasius says, yes, I think there are degrees of virtue in that sense. Now, it is the same virtue that you have to different degrees. It is the same virtue that you tend to act in accordance with to different degrees, or with different probabilities or different reliability, etc. So yes, someone can be just, but someone else even more just. Someone can be courageous, but even someone else more courageous. And he says that seems uncontroversial with respect to vices. Can someone be dishonest and someone else even more dishonest? Well, yes, clearly. Can somebody be unjust, someone else even more unjust? Yes. What about actions, though? With actions, it's more complicated. Suppose we think about an action being just, and then say, could another action be even more just? Here Aspasius says no. That can't happen. Now, why? Well, because the just outcome in a situation is the one that is fair. It is unique. Okay, so here, notice our questions get tied together. He says, suppose, for example, you're a judge, and someone facing a criminal charge comes up in the courtroom. You have to render a verdict. Is this something that is going to be just to different degrees? He says, no. Okay, the just outcome is innocent if the person is innocent, or guilty if the person is guilty, and then guilty of the specific crime that they're guilty of. And so to deviate from that is to be unjust. To, for example, find an innocent person guilty, but then maybe even of a misdemeanor and count it as a suspended sentence, or to let them off for time served or something. Still, that's an unjust outcome. They're innocent. They didn't do it. And so there can be, in this case, degrees of injustice. To find them guilty but suspend the sentence, that's still an injustice. Now, to find them guilty and send them to jail, that's even more unjust. To send them to jail for a longer period of time, that's even more unjust than that. So an action can be unjust to different degrees. On the other hand, a just action is a just action. You can't be just and something else even more just. So Aspasius says, there is something special about the nature of justice. Now, you might say the same thing about some other things. Correctness, for example. I ask you what the capital of a certain country is. What's the capital of Burkina Faso? There is one and only one answer that is correct. And if you don't give that answer, you're wrong. Now, it might be that you can be even more wrong. For example, you could really make some category mistake in your answer, or name a country or a continent instead of a city, etc. So there might be degrees of getting it wrong, degrees of incorrectness. But there's only one way to get it right. You're supposed to say Ouagadougou. If you say something else, if you say Cairo, for example, you're wrong. If you say Egypt, somehow that's even more wrong. If you say Africa, that's even more wrong than that, maybe. But there's one and only one way of getting it right. You can't be correct and someone else even more correct. Well, the same thing might be true for various other virtues. Arguably for honesty, for example. To be honest, you have to tell the truth. Can you be honest, but someone else even more honest? Well, if we're talking about people and states of character, then yes. But if we're talking about actions or responses, that was an honest response. But someone else's was even more honest. Aspasius says, I don't know if that's possible. Maybe not. Now, there's something special then about justice, about correctness, maybe about honesty, which has to do with the fact that if you have that virtue, or let me put it more precisely, if an action exhibits that virtue, you can't have another action that also exhibits it, but even more so. He calls those perfect virtues. That is to say, they really are complete. If you've attained justice in that action, there's nowhere else to go. You can't go further and be even more just. Or if you've answered honestly or correctly, you can't go further and answer even more honestly or more correctly. But not all virtues are like that. Let's think about courage. Can an action be courageous, but another action even more courageous? Intuitively, we want to say, well, yes. Let's say there's a burning building and you know there are people trapped inside. To go inside and try to rescue them is virtuous. To go into a smoke-filled room, for example, and look for people, very courageous action. On the other hand, to rush into some room where you not only see smoke, but you see flames, and you realize you're really risking your life in a very, very serious way by walking into that room. Maybe we count that as even more courageous. So in short, intuitively, we tend to draw a distinction between acting virtuously and acting heroically, acting in a way that is supererogatory, above and beyond the call of duty. And in those cases, we want to say, yes, that action can be virtuous, but another action might exhibit that virtue to an even higher degree, might be even more virtuous in that particular respect. And so those we might consider imperfect virtues. Now, Aspasius, to be clear, is not really careful about this distinction. He doesn't make this very clear, and he doesn't really fully develop this terminology. But later commentators, inspired by his discussion, do. And so we might define it this way. A perfect virtue is one that an action can have, and nothing else, no other action can have it to a higher degree. An imperfect virtue, one can exhibit in an action, but another action might exhibit it to an even greater degree. And so an imperfect virtue is imperfect in the sense, not that there's something wrong with it, but that in the sense that it's incomplete. You could become even more virtuous, and not only you as a person. Yes, that might be true in either case. However, that is something that individual choice of action might even have been more virtuous. It might even have exhibited that virtue to a higher degree. You could act courageously, but another action might have been even more courageous. However, you can't act justly and have another action such that it would have been even more just. So we might put it this way. Justice, correctness, and honesty are perfect virtues. They're complete. You can't improve on them. Generosity, kindness, and courage are imperfect. An action that exhibits one of those virtues could be improved on. Other possible actions could be even more virtuous. Now notice that vices don't exhibit this distinction. An action can be dishonest, but another might be even more dishonest. An answer could be incorrect. Something else could be even more incorrect. A verdict could be unjust. Another verdict could be even more unjust. And so vices don't respect this distinction at all. They're by their very nature imperfect. An action could always be worse, you might say, but some actions, if they are virtuous, can't actually be any better. The virtue there seems to be something like a point rather than a region.